This is the story of GoAir Flight 811. On the 11th of November 2019, a GoAir Airbus A320 was making the trip from Nagpur, India to Bangalore, also in India. The A320 is massively popular in India. Multiple of the country's largest airlines operate the type, from Indigo to Air India to today's video's subject, GoAir. Just to put into perspective how dominant the Airbus A320 is in Indian aviation, Delhi Airport is the busiest airport in the world for Airbus A320 flights. On this day, it was one of those A320s that was making the trek from Nagpur to Bangalore with 180 people on board. While on the ground at Nagpur, the pilots of Flight 811 kept a close eye on the weather at Bangalore. The weather was fine at the moment, with visibility hovering around 2,000 meters, but they expected it to get worse and be down to 800 meters in the near future. They added 4,100 kilos or about 9,000 pounds of extra fuel so that the plane could hold over Bangalore for about 2 hours and then divert to either Chennai or Hyderabad if needed. With the first officer at the controls, Flight 811 departed Nagpur at 12:24 a.m. UTC, and the plane made its way to Bangalore without much issue. But once it got to Bangalore, problems started to prop up. The weather at Bangalore wasn't the best. The pilots got to know that visibility was down to 200 meters. The runway visual range, which is basically the distance that a pilot would be able to see down the runway if he were on the centerline of the runway, was down to 1,500 meters. Now, this was bad, but as the plane was in contact with approach control while it was being vectored for an approach onto runway 09, the visibility at the airport kept falling. At 1:44 a.m. UTC, the ATC said, all station visibility 200 meter and RVR 1,200 meters. This would be the last bit of weather information that the pilots would get from ATC. By 1:46 a.m. UTC, the plane was established on the localiser for the ILS approach onto runway 09, and Flight 811 was handed off to the tower controllers, who would then guide the plane all the way down to the runway. But unknown to the crew, as they were flying the last few miles to the runway, the visibility at Bangalore International kept falling. As the A320 dropped in altitude, the first officer took control of the plane and stabilized it. At an altitude of about 220 feet, the autopilot was disconnected, and the pilots began searching for the runway in the fog. The plane kept losing altitude. The first officer was now pulling back on the sidestick, performing what's known as a flare. During the flare, when you're right over the runway, you pull back power and you increase pitch a bit, thereby reducing your rate of descent. This way you touch down smoothly on the runway. Note how I said over the runway. That is not where the pilots of Flight 811 found themselves. You see, during the approach, they kept expecting the runway to appear through the fog, but it never really did, not in its entirety. The captain looked down at the primary flight display, and to his horror, he saw that they were not lined up with the runway. They were now over a grassy area of the airport with the runway nowhere to be seen. Realizing this, the first officer immediately called for a go-around, but the plane was already on its way down. The main landing gear touched down into the grassy land. As the engines were spooling up for the go-around, the left-hand engine, or engine number 1, ingested some debris that was kicked up by the massive plane landing in the grass. As the plane lifted off again, the pilots were hit by a barrage of warnings right after they took off. They got an EGPWS warning about some obstacles in the area. Then immediately after that, they got a low speed warning, and after that, they got an engine 1 stall warning. All 3 warnings hit the pilots within a few seconds of each other. The long list of warnings left them with a disabled left-hand engine. Now the pilots of Flight 811 had to perform a go-around on just one engine. Don't fret though, planes are tested to their limits and back, and a one-engine go-around is well within the capabilities of an A320. With the left engine out of commission, the plane slowly climbed away from what might have been a catastrophe. Once in the air, the pilots stabilized the plane at a safe altitude, and they waited over the city of Bangalore to see if the weather would improve. But that seemed to not be the case as the weather kept getting worse. These pilots were now over a major city with one failed engine, and they needed to get this plane on the ground as soon as possible. So they decided to divert to the city of Hyderabad, which is about 283 miles away as the crow flies. Since the weather at Hyderabad was much better, the pilots coaxed the wounded plane to land at Hyderabad, where it made a safe landing. Once on the ground at Hyderabad, they got to see the extent of the damage that the plane had sustained. The main landing gear was coated with dirt and grass, and the left-hand engine had some damage done to the inside of it. I found a video online of the landing in question, and watching that will explain why the plane was in the shape that it was. Let's play the video. So now we have a question. How did that happen? How did a state-of-the-art airliner completely miss the runway at one of the most busiest airports in the country? Well, as with some other airports in India, like Delhi for example, the weather was quite temperamental. When the pilots took off, the weather at Bangalore was quite bad, but it was salvageable. But the thing is, at Bangalore, the fog really picks up at daybreak. If you did not fly into Bangalore a whole lot, then you would not know to expect that. The first officer of Flight 811 was just 25 years old, and he did not have a whole lot of experience under his belt. He only had 109 hours on the A320. You see where I'm going with this, right? Thus, when the approach was being made, the RVR dropped all the way down to 125 meters. To make matters worse, the sun was in such a position that it made seeing the runway even harder than it already was. So if visibility was falling, why weren't the pilots told about that? Bangalore did have a system that provided the controllers with RVR data, but the controller was relying on information sent out by the meteorological department, and that information said that the RVR was 1200 meters. But had he glanced over to the other screen off to his side, he would have seen that the RVR was falling. But since this information was displayed on another display that was partly blocked, the controller never really saw that. Since he had not seen the new RVR value on the second display, he kept on sending out the old information, thus depriving the crew of some valuable information that they could have used in their decision-making to continue the approach. Speaking of which, why didn't they just do that? Why didn't they just go around? Visibility was so bad that a 737 that they had been following went around as well. Well, when the 737 went around, that started a bit of talk in the cockpit about the go-around procedure. Along with this, the captain was monitoring the first officer's approach since the first officer was so low on experience. All of this was starting to add up as the captain's workload just kept getting higher and higher. Now, right before the landing, the rays of the sun was getting into the eyes of the first officer, and he mistook the left edge lights of the runway for the centerline lights. So he aligned the plane with the left edge lights. But by the time he realized his mistake, it was way too late. The plane had already touched down. It was truly scary how close this was to being a major disaster. The area that the plane touched down in had a lot of construction. They had mounds of dirt that the plane could have easily flown into. That would have meant that this would have ended very, very badly. Or what if engine number 2 failed like engine number 1? That would have meant that they would have been left powerless during a go-around over a densely populated city. Not a great situation to be in. Luckily for everyone involved, engine number 2 held out and corrective actions were taken just in time for this to not be a major disaster. But was there any technology that could have made this landing easier for the pilots? Airport ILS or instrument landing systems basically guide the plane to the foot of the runway. Bangalore was equipped with Cat 1 ILS, the not so precise kind. With Cat 1 ILS, it would take you in most of the way, and then once you had the runway in sight, you could either take manual control of the plane and land it, or you could let the plane do most of the flying while making sure that the runway was where it was supposed to be. But either way, in a Cat 1 landing, you had to make sure that the runway was in sight no matter what. But with a Cat 3 auto land approach, you don't need that. The plane can take you all the way in. What do you think about all of this? Do you think that this could have been a major accident? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.